appeal site itself. The Council's 2014 Landscape Character Assessment and Greenbelt Landscape Capacity Study Volume 2, CD 29, put the appeal site in Area 25, noting that there was no opportunity in Area 25 as a whole for residential development due to open character and impact on separation between Noak Bridge and Noak Hill, Great Burstead. A more detailed study of the appeal site was undertaken in the 2017 outline appraisal of potential development sites, where it was known as Site 32, CD 27. In this report, reference is made to the 2015 Greenbelt Review, and the following quotation about Area 25 from that document is set out. This area contributes to preventing neighbouring towns from merging into one another and preserving the setting and special character of historic towns, and should remain as Greenbelt. The assessment of Site 32, however, goes on to note that its location to the rear existing development and very limited footprint mean that it makes little contribution to Purpose 2, now Purpose B, to prevent neighbouring towns from merging, and therefore has a greater capacity to accommodate growth than the wider Area 25. The Site 32 analysis does not explicitly address the third Greenbelt purpose, safeguard the country from encroachment. It suggests an appropriate number of dwellings as 35 across the 1 hectare of the site with development potential. The 2017 Greenbelt Review, Mrs. Cook's Appendix 2, and I don't think there is a CD number for this, but it's at the Appendix 2 of Mrs. Cook, confusingly renames the wider parcel for assessment in that document as Parcel 25, although it appears to coincide exactly with Area 25 in the 2014 study. Parcel 25 is found to contribute to purposes 1, 2, 3, and 4, now A to D. Finally, the 2018 Greenbelt topic paper, CD 26, identifies the appeal site as New Site 3, which is found to be well screened from wider views and therefore to be less open to public view than Area 25 as a whole, and in consequence, together with its small footprint, unlikely to compromise the separation or rural breaks between Billericay and Basel and Purpose B. Overall, the site is found to have limited harm on the openness of the Greenbelt or the purposes of including land with it. Again, no assessment is made of the impact of development on Purpose C by this document. As mitigation, the 2018 topic paper analysis suggests design complementary to the site character in order to ensure any harm arising from development is mitigated. To Para 13. Purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Atkinson.
Pause while
That's okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. So this is obviously be an ID number as well. ID 9.
Right, I'm up to paragraph 13. So.
Thank you.
Purposes. In respect of Purpose B merging, it is of course accepted that the appeal site is small and located adjacent to existing development to the north and east, and its contribution to the prevention of towns merging can only be limited. This is the point Louise Cook makes. The reference to incremental loss is to the erosion of the rural break between parts of the towns, Billericay and Basildon, Great Burstead and Noak Bridge, respectively, when considered against existing development. It is for this reason that Mrs. Cook describes the impact on Purpose B as limited. This is in line with the overall assessment of the 2018 topic paper, which finds limited harm to the purposes, although it does explicitly find development of the site is unlikely to compromise separation between Billericay and Basildon. But to deny that there is any impact at all on this purpose, as is the appellant's position, is unrealistic and denies that most development in the Greenbelt is undertaken a little at a time. Mr. Crawford is correct to say that the development does not reduce the minimum distance between the towns along Southend Road, but it does, of course, reduce this distance across the open field to the west of Southend Road, the appeal site, by approximately 100 metres. This adds to the perception of merging. The proposed housing will be at least as prominent as the existing housing on the western side and the commercial development on the eastern side of Southend Road. And it cannot be said it will make no contribution to the perception of separation being eroded, particularly from the position of LVIA CD 103 viewpoint 4 on Southend Road. The existing housing along Mill Road is visible currently from viewpoint 4 across the appeal site itself, and the appeal scheme would spread across the field of view from there and be closer to the viewer. The additional trees proposed across the site are not likely to diminish the visual prominence of the proposed development. 4 are proposed along the central part of the southern boundary at the rear of plots 12 to 15, with a further 5 around the open space at the western end. It is not accepted by Mrs. Cook that the commercial development on the eastern side of Southend Road signifies the edge of the settlement, this development being read very differently to the housing on the western side. Mr. Crawford accepted that there are degrees of merging, but a hypothetical small site may add to the perception of merging, despite being small. It is not necessary for towns to actually establish contiguity for the purpose, which is to prevent merging, to be eroded. Such erosion of the small appeal site would be the effective development of this site in this case. In respect of the impact on purpose C encroachment, the simple fact of an otherwise open field being developed for housing must mean that there is a significant impact on this purpose, and Mrs. Cook is right to attribute significant harm to it. The nature of the existing development of the site has a reduced impact on encroachment because it is the sort of thing you'd expect to see in the countryside, as well as in the urban fringe or peri-urban areas, Mr. Crawford's phrase. Low-level sheds, barns, outbuildings, some involved in the keeping of horses, the manege itself, or sand school, all speak of rurality as opposed to a new housing estate, which is proposed. In the context of encroachment, the two are not comparable. The existing buildings, further, are largely hidden behind the housing on the western side of Southend Road. Overall, the council's position is that proposals would have a limited impact on purpose B, merging, and a significant impact on purpose C, encroachment. Openness. Spatially, the proposed houses, garages, boundary treatment, parked cars, etc., and all the inevitable paraphernalia will greatly erode this aspect of openness. This is the point made by the inspector in the decision Mrs. Cook should be, refers to. The impact on openness of the additional boundary treatments, plots, garden use and equipment, sheds, cars and so on for 47 units is considerable, and as Mr. Crawford accepted, likely to be greater than the existing fencing and ancillary items as are currently on the site. The figures presented by Mr. Crawford, which exclude all of the fences, paraphernalia, etc., are not contested, but they were initially presented by him oddly. It is agreed now to be more meaningful to say that there is proposed a near doubling of footprint, and 88, I think it was 80%, sorry, was the, that should be 80. Sorry,
yes, that's why I had
88 was my own calculation, but I got it wrong. 80% increase, and a more than doubling of volume, an increase of 124%. It is an artificial argument of Mr. Crawford's to point to a reduction in quantum of development on the eastern part of the site in the context of a currently open field to the west being proposed to be covered in development. Further, the division of the site into sub-areas in this way is the opposite of the assessment he has made of the appeal site elsewhere, where he has placed it, the appeal site, in the context of the wider assessment parcel. The prominence of the existing housing on Mill Road and Southend Road has been exaggerated by the opponent. The existing development is visible, but clearly foregrounded from the south by open land and presents a sense of openness. The existing development appears to be surrounded by open land. The housing on the western side of Southend Road is not visible from the position of VP4. What is proposed, the number of new buildings and their heights, 2 to 3 stories, will advance towards Southend Road by approximately 100 metres and be more visible from there, clearly eroding the visual sense of openness. Whether the housing itself is visible or when additional planting becomes established along the southern boundary, the housing behind the planting, the coverage of the open paddocks must erode the visual aspect of openness. It is not accepted that the existing housing on Mill Road and Southend Road are more prominent in this context than what is proposed. It was accepted by Mr. Crawford that the perception of activity within the site arising from the current equestrian use involving the keeping of just 5 horses by 4 family members and friends of Mr. Leach would be less than the comings and goings from 47 houses, from approximately, say, 100 to 150 people in total, at all times of day and night. The current equestrian activity is likely to be limited in daylight hours. As Ms. Bevan puts it, the design aspect of the proposed scheme also aggravate harm to the openness of the greenbelt through the site's compact organisation and cramped gridded layout, creating a closed environment, lack of green front infrastructure and planting. The continuous frontages created by linking houses with carports, the extent of hard landscaping and car parking, allowing the cars to dominate, lack of facilities to facilitate a walkable neighbourhood and open undeveloped land, and consistent roof lines. These aspects of design all bear on openness specifically. Her point in cross-examination that openness is limited must be understood in the context of the scope of her evidence overall, which is plainly set out and at her proof, at her proof paragraph 1.6, where she repeats the areas of disagreement from the statement of common ground that her evidence is to address. Particular area of disagreement 7, the design, including layout and appearance of the proposed development, and impact on the greenbelt in this respect. In a reference to the paragraphs of the framework, emphasis added. Nothing in paragraph 6.6.3 of Ms. Bevan's proof can displace this clear understanding of what she is addressing. As she explained in re-examination, the paragraph 6.6.3 is essentially stating at a level of generality what is agreed, that development of an open field will inevitably affect openness. Before her paragraph 6.6.4 sets out specific points about how design bears on openness. Ms. Bevan has only ever been addressing the design impacts on openness, and her evidence should be understood in that context. Many of these design weaknesses and adverse impacts on openness flow from the development of 47 houses on the site, in excess of both the 35 suggested in the Site 32 analysis and the recommendation of 20 self-build made in 2017. Overall, the Council's position is that substantial harm will be caused to the openness of the greenbelt by the proposed development. This meets the policy threshold for Framework 149G. Issue 3, the effect of the proposals on the character and appearance of the area. Starting point must be the 2014 Landscape Character Assessment, CD28, characterisation of the area within which the appeal site sits as LCA 12, Burstead sloping farmland. It is accepted, of course, both that this is a wide area of which the appeal site forms a small part. Mr. Crawford accepts that the wider area within the appeal site sits does share many of the characteristics of LCA 12, but that the appeal site itself does not, for 3 main reasons. The existing visible housing, particularly to the north of the site, and the A129 itself having an urbanising influence, as do the existing buildings on the site in equestrian use, and the high degree of containment of the appeal site, which is a result essentially of the strong vegetation boundaries currently, particularly to south and west. These points are essentially the same as are advanced by Mr. Crawford in support of his arguments that the perception of openness is already diminished and the countryside has already been encroached upon. There is a tension throughout these arguments in that the existing housing to the north of the site is said, this by Mr. Crawford, of course, said both to be widely visible so as to exert an urbanizing influence, that is 6.5.8, yet at the same time the appeal site is said to have a high degree of containment, which significantly limits intervisibility with the wider landscape, is 6.2.2. These statements can't both be correct at the same time. It is from the south that the site is least well screened. The Council's Site 32 analysis acknowledges the importance of the boundary hedges and the effect they have in containing the site visually. Similarly, the new Site 3 analysis in the 2018 topic paper makes the same points. The main issue between the parties in respect of the impact on character appearance, as well as openness and purpose C, is therefore the extent to which the site may already be visible from the wider area, and whether the existing housing developments surrounding the site and the existing development on the site have an urbanizing effect. The site is contained visually, particularly from the west, and Ms. Bevan is clear that its being relatively concealed is a feature of the site, but the vegetation is far less established on the southern boundary, with little additional planting proposed. The existing housing to the north is currently visible, particularly from viewpoint 4, as of course is the South End Road itself, but it is an overstatement to suggest that either of these features have an urbanizing influence on what remains mostly an open field. Similarly, the development that is on the site currently, some of it in equestrian use and the equestrian use of the paddocks themselves, is low level, hidden behind the housing along South End Road, and characteristic of a site on the urban fringe, or as Ms. Bevan puts it, at the point where the town fizzles out into the countryside. Again, it is an overstatement to suggest this development gives the appeal site an urban influence. Ms. Bevan's suburban seems more apposite. Ms. Bevan explains how the site's relatively concealed nature works both ways, and in this case the design solution has produced an inward-looking scheme which presents awkwardly to the street scene, which harms the character and appearance of the area. Overall, Ms. Bevan finds harm to the character and appearance to be moderate, adverse / limited. The confusion in her cross-examination appears to arise from her using the word limited to describe the extent to which the site is visually concealed, which limits the way in which the site may visually detract from its context. Issue 4. Harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm, including greenbelt purposes, be clearly outweighed by other considerations so as to amount to VSCs required to justify the proposal. As noted above, the parties agree that all of the site within the greenbelt is PDL. If you so agree with this assessment, then section 149G, second limb, comes into play. It is agreed that the proposal would reuse PDL to contribute to meeting an identified affordable housing need in the area of the LPA. The key determination for you is whether the proposal would cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt. If you find that the proposal does cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt, then the development is inappropriate in the greenbelt, and the proposal must then be assessed against framework 147148. If you find the proposal do not cause substantial harm, that is, that you find either that they cause no harm or cause harm, some level of harm less than substantial, then the proposals are not inappropriate, and you determine the appeal in the usual way, what Mr. Bell calls the section 38.6 balance. In the terms of the framework 11D, it is agreed that the policies that are most important for determining the application are out of date, so the decision taker is expected to grant permission unless the greenbelt policies that it is agreed are referred to in 11D1 provide a clear reason to refuse. It can be seen that the application of 11D1 alone allows for both outcomes, approval or refusal. What is not permitted in a greenbelt case is to consider 11D1 and 11D2. That's the finding of the High Court, approved by the Court of Appeal in the Monk Hill case, and it's spelled out at paragraph 3912. The application of some footnote 6 policies, for example, greenbelt, requires all relevant planning considerations to be weighed in the balance. In those cases, because the outcome of that assessment determines whether planning should be granted or refused, there is no justification for applying Lim 2 in addition to Lim 1. So that case is in the papers, I think. It was certainly, yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you. You'll be able to read the whole thing, of course. Into the above routes to judgment must be fed the following factors with the weight the council attributes to them. If NPF 148 is applied, this requires that substantial weight is given to any harm to the greenbelt. In this case, on the harm side, there is harm by way of inappropriateness, harm to purposes, that to purpose B we accept as limited, that to purpose C significant, with corresponding weight. The harm to the openness the council finds substantial and to which is attached substantial weight, with a limited impact arising from the design of the scheme. Moderate weight may be put on the limited or moderate impact of the proposals on the character and appearance of the area. Of the other considerations and benefits, substantial weight must be given to the provision of market and affordable housing given the council's housing land supply position. Council further gives very substantial weight to the provision of the 7 additional affordable units that reflect the provision over and above the council's policy requirement. On reflection, and contrary to the statement of common ground, the council gives limited weight to economic benefits, it not being clear that the household expenditure that will be made can be said to be additional in the local area on the basis of the generic HBF figures. No weight is given to the BNG by the council because they are required to mitigate or compensate for the impacts of the proposal, and the condition by which they are offered makes the proposal acceptable in this regard. It is necessary also to consider the evidence about the freestanding design points as explored at the design roundtable. Whilst the primary part of the council's case on design is how it bears on openness, a careful reading of the first reason for refusal does reveal with the words "and would fail to provide a high quality, beautiful place, nor add to the quality of the area," a separate design point. This analysis is shared by the appellants. See Mr. Pullen's proof at his paragraph 2.5 and Mr. Bell at his 5.101, both addressing this aspect of the reason for refusal discreetly. So I should make clear, so I'm not suggesting that those Mr. Pullen and Mr. Bell agree with the council's evidence about design, but what I mean is they identified that as a discrete issue, so they've considered it. Overall, the council's case is that the proposal does cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt, such that it is inappropriate development. The other considerations do not amount to VSCs so as to outweigh the harm to the greenbelt by reason of inappropriate, harm to openness and purposes, and harm to the character of the appearance of the area. In accordance, therefore, with framework 11D1, permission should be repealed.
Thank you. On 49, see, I'm reading for the first time, so I'm thinking straight through. Paragraph 49, are you saying the tilted balance shouldn't apply irrespective of my conclusions on greenbelt? I'm still trying to think this through.
Yeah, I think that's what it says. Yeah,
we address this in our closing.
Okay, so that's, I think I'd like your opinion on that as well, please.
We deal exactly with that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Atkinson. Shall we have the short break?
We're just going to, what
Okay.
we're going to do is we've got our closings, we're just going to send them over to, not quite sure who you're going to send them to Louise. And then, yes, if then we could hit go on the printer and then at least get the inspector a copy and then obviously more copies as they come, then we could kick off, in 10-15 minutes or however long you like. So
Yes. I mean, are you happy with just 10 minutes and then come back? Because it's
certainly,
a half day, so I don't think this is much time.
Absolutely, sir. No, sure. 10
Okay,
minutes.
so it's 11:02. So should we resume at 11:12?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The inquiry is adjourned. Thank you.
not here. That may be that she's at the printer.
Yes, possibly.
Yeah, the printing is quite slow, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But it is.
Your calls are happy to do it either way you want it. You may well prefer to have it in front of you.
Let's just give it 2 minutes. Let's say
Sure.
15:15, we'll start.
Yes, sure. It should have come to the case
Okay,
officer.
well, being able to see it sometimes takes 2 hours. To
Of
actually get
course,
through to
yes,
me,
of
but
course.
Let me look at my emails.
Fine. Okay, so I'll go slowly. If you obviously if I'm coming your way, if there's anything you'd like me to slow down over or whatever, just let me know. But I take it it's not come through to you. Okay. Righto. This is the heading's introduction. For all the many documents that are before you, sir, the issues in the appeal are now simple. The most important points are all agreed. In particular, the council agrees with us that, firstly, the adopted local plan is from another era. The basis on which the countryside and the greenbelt boundaries were drawn, we agree, is completely out of date. The council's own projection is that a new plan is at least 5 years away. Second, the shortfalls in market and affordable housing in this borough. Here we go, just in time. Not at all. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're just at B, sir, on the first page.
Okay, so this is ID. I can't remember what number. The last one. 10.
Last one. B then, the shortfalls in market and affordable housing in this borough are staggering. The council agrees that thanks very much indeed. They are severe and acute. The council's most recent housing delivery test score was the 7th worst in the country. It's agreed, sir, that if this borough's housing needs are to be met, use of greenbelt land is inevitable, and we agree that when choosing between sites, brownfield land is sequentially preferable. It should be turned to first. We agree that our site's in a highly sustainable location. It's on the edge of a settlement, which is a major focus for growth. We agree that the part of the appeal site which falls within the greenbelt is previously developed land, and the rest of the site lies within the built-up area of Billericay. We agree that the character of this site is at least partly suburban, and that it is at least relatively concealed and contained. And we agree that if the appeal proposals cause anything less than substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt, be it limited, be it moderate, or even significant harm, then the appeal should be allowed. One of the council's witnesses, Ms. Bevan, agrees with us that the proposals will not cause substantial harm to openness. More of that later. If, sir, the appeal proposals would cause substantial harm to openness, we agree that the appeal should be allowed anyway if its benefits clearly outweigh its harms. More on that later. We agree that the appeal scheme has at least substantial benefits because we agree that very substantial weight should be afforded to at least some of its provision of affordable housing. The council accepts that at least substantial weight should be afforded to the scheme's provision of market housing. Our case is that that benefit should also be afforded very substantial weight. And we agree that there's no technical constraints to delivery in relation to highways, heritage, ecology, air quality, drainage, flooding, or anything else. In the end, if this council ever wants to start meeting the shortfalls, not of tens or hundreds, but thousands of homes, then this is the kind of scheme it's going to have to start approving, as the council itself accepted when promoting this site for allocation until as recently as February of this year. So we begin with the heading that the plan-led system has failed in Basildon. This part of Essex has been let down by the planning system. Years go by, decades pass, national policies come and go, but through it all, this council's managed to keep its head buried firmly in the sand. There's been no strategic review of Basildon's Greenbelt for 30 years. New plan-making exercises have been tried. They have failed. The adopted plan is from another era. The Basildon local plan was adopted in 1998 with a period running to 2001. It was designed in a totally different national policy context. It sought to address the needs of a different generation, in particular the requirements set by the Essex Structure Plan, which itself was first adopted in 1982. Many moons before the radical shift brought about by the first NPPF, which made meeting objectively assessed needs for housing not just a material consideration, but one of particular standing. The Greenbelt and settlement boundaries in the adopted plan were fixed through the Billericay local plan, which dates back even further to 1989, and the basis on which those boundaries were drawn is now completely out of date, which obviously has a bearing on how much weight they can be given, and Ms Cook accepted all of that in cross-examination. A new plan for Basildon was submitted to the Secretary of State for examination in March of 2019, and through that plan, the council proposed that swathes of Greenbelt land be released. It was, as Ms Cook accepted, inevitable, because 63% of the borough is currently within the Greenbelt, which is basically everything outside the urban boundaries. Housing needs simply can't be met in Basildon without the release of land from the Greenbelt. The appeal site was among those the council intended to release from the Greenbelt for housing through the 2019 plan. The council's own evidence base, which supported the proposed allocation, demonstrated it's a very well contained site with low landscape sensitivity, which is appropriate for significant residential development. In 2017, the council's landscape appraisal of potential development sites confirmed that our site has low landscape sensitivity, makes a limited contribution to delivering Greenbelt purposes, and there was development potential across the site. The council's 2018 Greenbelt topic paper describes the site's visual containment by well-established hedges and the built edge of South Green, the site's relative flatness, that it's well screened from wider views, that development of the site is unlikely to compromise the separation or rural break between Billericay and Basildon, and so development of the site would have limited harm on the openness of the Greenbelt or its purposes, and that position was confirmed in the 2018 Housing Options topic paper, and indeed subsequent healers have confirmed, and indeed still confirm, the site's suitability for residential development. Earlier this year, the emerging local plan was withdrawn, and we are now told that the council doesn't expect to adopt a new one until the end of 2027, which is over 5 years away, almost 3 decades after the current plan was adopted, and of course it may take longer. Still, the council recognises that there are several factors which may impact upon the ability of the council to keep to the timetable for the production of the local plan documents, including changes to national policy guidance or legislation and changing political priorities. And so Ms Cook accepted that the council's projection for adoption by the end of 27, it's not set in stone. We've got no idea if or when a new plan will be adopted. It could be many more years from now. So it's clear that the plan-led system has failed in Basildon. There's no framework for addressing the borough's housing needs. The out-of-datedness of the adopted plan is, as Mr Bell put it, staggering, and it flies in the face of the requirement in the NPPF for plans to be reviewed at least every 5 years. The consequences of the council's failure to plan are serious, and they're agreed that the scale of the housing shortages, again, are staggering. We come back to them below. Ms Cook rightly accepted they are very substantial indeed. And we know, and again, Ms Cook agreed, that if the borough's housing needed to be met, use of greenbelt land is inevitable. That's not a choice. It's a certainty. There is literally no other option. We know that if the council's to start addressing its needs now, the challenge cannot be met through the plan-led system. Ms Cook agreed there's no prospect of a plan-led solution to the problem in the short or medium term. Housing needs must instead be addressed through a development management process, through planning applications, ideally on sustainably located brownfield sites, just like this one. Turn first then to the scheme's benefits, which are very substantial, and we start with affordable housing. There's agreed to be an acute need for more affordable homes in Basildon. The numbers in Mr Stacey's evidence tell a dreadful story. Ms Richardson confirmed that all of the numbers are agreed. Over the last 7 years alone, the council has accumulated a shortfall of 2,494 homes. There's been on average only 5 affordable homes delivered per year over that period, which amounts to just 1% of total housing completions. In Bursted Ward, where the appeal site's located, there were 9 affordable housing completions in all of the last 7 years. All of them happened in a single year. Mr Stacey rightly described the situation as a disaster, and Mr Davey for the council describes the shortfalls as severe. As Mr Stacey's evidence shows, at the current rate of delivery, it is inconceivable that the council will address its staggering shortfalls. He estimates there'll be a net addition of only 56 affordable homes per year over the next 5 years, compared to its needs for affordable housing, which is for 860 new affordable homes each year, based on removing the backlog, as he described it, the Sedgefield approach. He described that as a drop in the ocean. So the situation's not going to improve. It's going to get much worse. And these shortfalls have real consequences, of course, for real people. Those on lower quartile incomes now need almost 11 times their annual income to buy a home, 32% increase on the position only 7 years ago. There are now almost 2,300 households on the council's housing register. That's a 44% increase on the year before. It's 13 new households joining the register every week, and each property in Billericay, which becomes available, is attracting hundreds and hundreds of bids from people desperate to get off that waiting list and to make their lives in this area. 1 and 3 bed properties are attracting over 800 bids each. It's easy to get lost in these numbers, but as Inspector Young reminded us in the Oxford Brooks decision, each one of those households on the register represents a real person or family in urgent need who have been let down by a persistent failure to deliver enough affordable houses. Indeed, the people who lie behind the numbers in Mr Stacey's evidence are some of the most vulnerable in our society. This inquiry has not heard from them. In recent years, the Secretary of State has made his view on this issue clear in a series of decisions in Greenbelt authorities where the plan-led system's not delivered either on time or at all, including South Oxfordshire and Bradford. He's given the delivery of affordable housing, and for that matter, market housing, very substantial weight, not just substantial, very substantial weight, and he's found that it clearly outweighs harm to Greenbelt, so carrying the balance at 148 of the framework. And indeed, last year, in the Colney Heath appeal decision, Inspector Krista Masters recognised that the persistent under-delivery of affordable housing, this was in Welland, Hatfield and St Albans, presented what she called a critical situation, taking into account the extremely acute affordable housing position in those districts. She afforded that scheme's delivery of 45 affordable homes very substantial weight. Mr Stacey said that he considered the affordable housing position in Basildon to be at least comparable to that which was at issue in Colney Heath, and in some respects he suggested the situation in Basildon is worse. And as Mr Bell added, it shouldn't be forgotten that the site at issue in Colney Heath, unlike our site, was entirely greenfield and had never been proposed for allocation in a local plan. And the housing land supply position is worse in Basildon than in either of those local authority areas at issue in that appeal. Now, our appeal scheme would deliver 45% of our homes as affordable. That is 21 affordable homes, which is agreed to significantly exceed the percentage required by the council's policies. Local policy does not prescribe any particular mix of tenure affordable housing. It's left for parties to agree, and the agreement is to mix, and tenure reached in this case is in the 106 we've just been through and confirmed by the Statement of Common Ground. Local policy doesn't provide any basis for preferring one type of affordable housing over another, and nor for that matter does national policy or guidance. All affordable homes are to be treated equally. Ms Cook afforded this benefit substantial weight in the planning balance, taking a different approach to the Secretary of State in South Oxfordshire, Bradford, and to Inspector Masters at Colney Heath. And she did so, she said, because 21 affordable homes is, quote, not a huge amount. But as Mr Stacey pointed out, in the context of the council's current net delivery, and we're talking about 5 affordable homes a year, 21 affordable homes is a significant number. In any event, as he explained, the assessment of weight should be based on percentage of homes offered as affordable, not raw numbers, because each scheme can only be assessed on its own merits. The fact that a bigger scheme on a bigger site somewhere else could deliver a higher number of units is with respect to material. What matters is that the shortfalls are staggering, and that 21 new affordable homes would make a real difference to real people in real need now. In the roundtable session, the council's position shifted as Richardson accepted that the scheme's provision of affordable housing should be afforded very substantial weight, at least in respect of those units which go over and above the policy requirement of 30%. And so there's not much left between us on affordable housing, only whether very substantial weight should be afforded to the whole of this benefit, that's our position, whether the benefit should be sliced up, if you like, and very substantial weight afforded only to part of it, which is the council's position. In the end, Mr Bell concluded the situation in Basildon is so dire that you can't underestimate the weight that should be given to every affordable home.
Quite a long test.
It is a long test, isn't it? I was thinking, God, it's working. Okie dokie.
Not sure.
I'll just give it a no.
Does that normally happen?
How long does it normally go on for? You've really got to hope there's not a proper fire that happens at 11:30. A no. There we go. Well, hey, let's hope there was no fire. Now, in the end, as Mr Bell concluded, the situation in Basildon is so dire that you can't underestimate the weight that should be given to every affordable home. Not every affordable home which exceeds the policy requirement, but to every single much needed affordable home. We turn then to market housing. It's common ground, of course, the council's not got a 5-year housing land supply. Its supply is agreed to stand somewhere in the range of 1.65 years to 2.32 years. And I won't read all the footnotes out, obviously, but we give you a reference to Hallam Lamb, which is a case that tells you that you can approach this appeal on the basis of a range. You don't need to fix a figure within that range. On the council's best case, its shortfall in housing delivery over the next 5 years is 3,345 homes. And in our case, the position is starker still, a shortfall of almost 4,200 homes. All of those numbers are measured against a minimum 5-year targets, which should be a floor and not a ceiling for delivery. Of course, the council's also failed the most recent housing delivery test, not by hundreds, but well over 1,000 homes. Its score of 41% was, as I've said already, the 7th worst in the country. And indeed, it was lower than its very low score of 45% the year before. Ms Cook agreed that the shortfalls looking backwards are very substantial indeed, and that the shortfalls looking forwards are severe. Ms Cook agreed that this means that some of the most important central government objectives are not being met in Basildon. The imperative at paragraph 8 of the framework to ensure that a sufficient number and range of homes are provided to meet the needs of present and future generations. The objective at paragraph 60 of the framework to significantly boost the supply of homes, and of course the requirement of paragraph 74 for local planning authorities to demonstrate a minimum of 5-year housing land supply. You might not have liked the word, but the truth is that in this borough, the plan-led system has failed. The appeal scheme would deliver 47 new homes within the next 5 years, which is an important benefit on which she gives substantial weight, but given the scale of the crisis in Basildon, Mr. Bell instead affords it very substantial weight, just as I've said, as the Secretary of State did in South Oxfordshire and Bradford, and just as Inspector Masters did in Colney Heath. We turn next to making effective use of land. Of course, national policy requires us to promote effective use of land in meeting needs, including for new homes. It also requires us to promote and support the development of underutilised land, especially if this would help to meet housing needs in areas where housing land supply is constrained. Further still, national policy requires us to give substantial weight to the value of using suitable brownfield land within settlements for homes. Now, these are points of particular importance in a place like Basildon, whereas we've seen unmet housing need is considerable and where most of the land is within the Greenbelt. Part of the appeal site, 9% of it, lies within the built-up area of Billericay. All of the site which falls within the Greenbelt is previously developed land. You've got a map of that in Appendix 2 to the Addendum Statement of Common Ground. Ms Cook accepted this. For the first time, it should be said in cross-examination. The paddocks are, she accepted, within the curtilage of a permanent structure, which is to say the stable block, which means that they fall within the NPPF's definition of PDL. Now, the use of Greenbelt land for housing is, she agreed, inevitable in Basildon, as we've said, and so when brownfield sites like this one come along, it's particularly important to optimise their use, because otherwise additional pressure will be placed on greenfield sites within the Greenbelt elsewhere. Now, the appeal site is, in this sense, a sequentially preferable site. When you're looking for Greenbelt sites for housing, it's one that the council should be choosing first. And with that too, of course, Ms Cook agreed. And that takes us to the planning balance. Mr Bell explained that significant weight should be afforded to the effective use the appeal scheme would make of previously developed land, as Inspector Wyatt did in the Olney appeal, where, unlike here, the site was wholly outside the settlement boundary, and so it was deemed, quote unquote, open countryside. For that part of our site which falls within the settlement boundary, the point assumes even greater force, because for that part, in accordance with the framework 120C, substantial weight should be afforded to the use of suitable brownfield land within settlements or homes. And other benefits, Mr Bell explained, there'll be a range of other benefits to be weighed in the planning balance, economic benefits, which will be given significant weight, and the benefit of a 10% biodiversity net gain, which exceeds, of course, local and national policy requirements, which will be given substantial weight. Now, on character and appearance, the scheme will cause no harm to the landscape beyond the site itself. The appeal site lies on the southern edge of Billericay. It's bounded to the north and east by the rear gardens of houses on Mill Road and Southend Road. The presence of existing development is something that Mr Crawford assessed as being very apparent in the surrounding landscape. To the south and to the west, the site separated from open fields by strongly defined boundaries of hedgerows and trees. The site's agreed to be an equestrian and not agricultural use. Ms Bevan agreed that the site, that the character of the site is at least partly suburban, that it's relatively concealed and contained. She agreed that the site is well screened by dense planting along the western boundary. She disagreed with Mr Crawford's assessment of the screening to the south. She agreed that the appeal site does not form part of a valued landscape within the meaning of the framework, and that it's not subject to any landscape designations, local, regional, national. She agreed too that the site's inclusion in the Metropolitan Greenbelt doesn't tell us anything at all about the quality of its landscape. The Greenbelt is a purely spatial designation, contrary to what that word green might imply to a layperson, and indeed contrary to what Miss Bevan herself implied at times. She agreed that things like natural features and rurality are not essential characteristics of the Green Belt. As Mr Crawford explained, There are landscapes in the Greenbelt of a very high quality. He gave the example of Chiltern's AONB, whilst other landscapes in the Greenbelt are of poor quality. On the other hand, he pointed out lots of towns and cities aren't surrounded by any Greenbelt at all, but nonetheless have very attractive landscapes. So the short point is there is no connection at all between the quality of a landscape and its designation or not as Greenbelt. In his evidence, Mr. Crawford reviewed the LBIA submitted for the application, which followed national best practice guidance, which is commonly referred to as GLIVIA 3. He also undertook his own assessment, again, adopting the structured approach that GLIVIA 3 requires. First, he identified the parcel of land which has the potential to be affected by the appeal proposals in his figure. He assessed the landscape sensitivity of the appeal site and of the wider assessment parcel as low. There were 4 components to that assessment, considered in turn and then cumulatively: quality, value, character sensitivity, and landscape visual sensitivity. Having assessed the baseline, Mr. Crawford moved on to the proposal's effects. And the only adverse effect he identified was a moderate minor effect on the landscape character of the appeal site itself. Even this was, he said, finely balanced, given that the proposals would improve the site in some respects by removing the existing not beautiful set of buildings. He concluded that the appeal proposals would cause no harmful visual effects in those few locations where it would be seen. He considered it would be seen as a natural and modest extension of the residential development that's already there. The views would be, as he put it, neither better nor worse, just a bit different. The visual effects are accordingly not harmful, they're neutral. Now, Ms. Bevan did not prepare an LVIA or indeed otherwise adopt a similar structured approach, nor did she take any issue with the methodology that Mr. Crawford employed. What she offered, she said, was simply her own judgment on landscape impacts. Now, her judgment was something which crystallised only as the inquiry progressed. She suggested for the first time in cross-examination that the appeal site, for example, has a medium sensitivity to new development. She suggested for the first time in her evidence in chief that the appeal proposals would cause a moderate degree of harm in relation to character and appearance. Whether she meant to landscape character or to visual receptors or to both was not clear. She said that her assessment was based on 2 things. First, on her review of a series of documents prepared on behalf of the council, including landscape appraisals, which form part of the evidence base for the now shelved local plan. And second, on what she saw when she visited the site herself. Now, she said that despite the council's landscape appraisal actually reaching a different conclusion, namely that the appeal site has a lower landscape sensitivity throughout and that it has development potential at a density of 35 dwellings per hectare. The fact that Ms. Bevan disagreed with the very council documents upon which her evidence was based was yet another point which emerged for the first time in cross-examination. It was certainly not something she confronted in her proof. In evidence in chief, Mr. Crawford explained why it's important for an expert's methodology to be clearly and transparently explained, because without setting out a clear methodology and articulating a clear line of reasoning based on verifiable facts, it's impossible to follow their evidence through to understand how their conclusions are reached. Without this clear and transparent explanation of methodology, their evidence amounts to little more than a statement of, "This is my opinion, trust me, I know what I'm doing." He said it was very difficult to follow and to engage with Ms. Bevan's evidence. She did not clearly explain, either in writing or in person, how she reached her conclusions on landscape sensitivity or indeed on landscape and visual effects. And with respect, Mr. Crawford is the only robust landscape evidence you've got, sir. He's the only qualified landscape architect who presented any evidence to the inquiry. Ms. Bevan's evidence amounts to little more than, as Mr. Bell assessed it, vague assertion. And so Mr. Crawford's conclusions should be preferred. The appeal proposals would have no adverse landscape impacts other than a moderate minor effect on the landscape character of the site itself. The scheme's impacts are on the wider green belt will be negligible. First, on openness, Ms. Cook accepted that when assessing openness, it's necessary to start by looking at the baseline to analyse the difference between what's on the site now and what's proposed. There is substantial built form on this site already. There's a number of buildings, hard standing, and associated paraphernalia, including metal fencing, stored materials and equipment. In fact, around half of the proposed built footprint's already there. As Mr. Crawford explained, this isn't a case of absolute transformation of a site with nothing on it, that the proposed development will be spread fairly evenly across the appeal site would actually result in a reduction in the quantum of development in the eastern part of the site where the existing development is concentrated. And visibility of the proposed development will be limited by the existing vegetation on the southern and western boundaries. Additional tree planting along the southern boundary will strengthen this screening effect, and from locations where the appeal scheme will be seen, existing development on Mill Road and South End Road is more prominent and diminishes the existing perception of openness. On the basis of all of that, Mr. Crawford concluded there'll be a moderate loss of openness within the site itself and a negligible degree of harm within the wider assessment parcel, which will be fundamentally unchanged. Now, Ms. Cook accepted that if the appeal site is to be developed at all, some degree of harm to openness is inevitable. The only question is how much. In her proof, she made clear that in answering that question, she'd relied on the evidence given by Ms. Bevan. Ms. Bevan's oral evidence was that the extent of harm to the Greenbelt's openness would be limited. Now, in its closings, the council tries to get away from that concession of limited harm to openness by saying that her evidence was just about design, but it wasn't. See her proof, for example, at paragraph 6.6.3, where she said that it's evident that a development on this scale cannot avoid impacting on the openness of the Greenbelt. The scheme would have a significantly more built volume than the current site, etc., etc. Do read the whole paragraph, of course. These aren't conclusions about design, they're conclusions about openness. Full stop. And they are consistent with the conclusions which were reached in the Council's 2018 Greenbelt topic paper and its 2018 housing options paper. In the evidence of Ms. Bevan and even in the Council's closings, continued references are being made to these high-level assessments of what is called Area 25. But as we've seen, that area includes a vast swathe of land which extends most of the way down from Billericay to Basildon. The appeal site is a tiny and well-contained corner of that wider area. And of course, the council's assessments have consistently assessed its capacity for development differently from that wider area. Mrs. Cook said that when she was preparing her proof, she'd assumed that Ms. Bevan was supporting a case of substantial harm to openness, which means Ms. Cook accepted that at least part of the basis on which she prepared her own evidence was wrong. And yet, even as Ms. Bevan made clear that her evidence only pointed to a finding of limited harm to openness, Ms. Cook maintained that there would be substantial harm to the Greenbelt's openness. And in maintaining that position, she stands alone, apart not only from our witnesses, but also from the council's other witness, and indeed from the many studies of this site undertaken by the council and on the council's behalf over many years. The council's case accordingly requires you, sir, a bit unusually, not just to choose between our evidence and the council's evidence, but between the evidence of the council's own witnesses. Both Mr. Crawford and Mr. Bell said they found it difficult to understand how Ms. Cook reached her conclusion on openness, given that she did not define the criteria she used or otherwise set out any methodology, and she did accept in cross-examination that substantial sits right at the top end of a scale of harm to openness, an assessment with which Mr. Bell agreed, substantial being a very high bar, with moderate harm sitting comfortably below that threshold. But as Mr. Crawford explained, it's difficult to see how this case can come even close to reaching that top end of harm. He asked, where then would we be if this were instead an untouched rural landscape with no existing development and no existing suburban influences? Our case just can't be at the top end of the scale. It can't be a case of substantial harm to openness. There must be a great deal further on the scale of harm to go. Mr. Bell explained why Mr. Crawford's evidence on openness should be preferred. He, as in Mr. Crawford, provides a methodical, very clear, evidence-based approach which stands up to scrutiny, and conversely, and again with respect, Mrs. Cook's evidence on this was founded on vague and unsubstantiated assertion. Design So the council has not taken a freestanding detailed design objection, but it does consider the proposal design to bear on their impact on the green belt's openness. And in the roundtable session, Miss Bevan raised a scattering of design points. First, she criticised the location of the open space. But as Mr. Pullen explained, it's appropriately located at the lowest part of the site where it'll contribute to the scheme's transition to the countryside beyond. It'll be an attractive space, room for more play, benefiting from surveillance from plots 15 and from plot 16. And residents and visitors will also have lightly trafficked shared street spaces in the central space close to the main entrance as places to meet. Second, she queried the safety of the shared surfaces without any technical basis for doing so. Of course, Essex County Council, the Highways Authority, considers the proposed development, including its internal roads and footways, to be completely acceptable. Thirdly, she didn't consider the scheme to be responding to its surroundings, but as Mr. Pullen observed, this is not an area of particular local distinctiveness. The surrounding housing is not identified for any particular characteristic or feature that differentiates it from other housing areas in the town. There's an opportunity for this site to develop its own character. Ms. Bevan said herself that housing around the surrounding buildings are not that great. What the appeal scheme does, Mr. Pullen explained, is to draw on the best elements like the coloured cladding and render, and it enhances the current position. The distinctive gatehouse makes a real contribution to the frontage of Southend Road. Ms. Bevan accepted that the proposals suggested that the proposals amount to overdevelopment of the appeal site. But as Mr. Pullen pointed out, none of the usual markers of overdevelopment are there. Unacceptable impacts on residential amenity, unacceptable dwellings or garden sizes are at issue here. And the council has accepted that the appeal site can accommodate development at a density of 35 dwellings a hectare, and our scheme's got a lower density, 32 dwellings a hectare. This is not overdevelopment. Ultimately, this is, as Mr. Pullen explained, a well-designed scheme. It'll optimise the site's use. It'll be a well-connected and attractive place to live, contained by a well-defined landscape and built boundaries. It'll sit very well within its edge of settlement context, which Ms. Bevan accepts as suburban, at least in part, and see again the image, again in black and white, that hopefully you've got in colour somewhere from Mr. Cullen's evidence. And of course, the design before you, sir, largely replicates the approach taken in the 2018 application, where the council tellingly had no objections in relation to design. Ms. Bevan suggested the appellant made too much of the council's approval of the 2018 scheme, as there was less of an emphasis placed on design then, she said, compared with now. But as Mr. Pullen pointed out, it's reasonable to assume that design was very much on this council's agenda way back in 2018, because it had endorsed the Essex Design Guide in June of that year, before the 2018 application went to committee in September. The policy and guidance referred to in the 2018 officers' reports essentially the same as that which now applies. And whilst Ms. Bevan said that the fact this is essentially the same scheme that was approved in 2018 scares her, it was more than reasonable for the appellant to seek to replicate a proposal that it knew to have council support. Ms. Bevan says the world's changed a great deal in the intervening 4 years, including as a consequence of the climate crisis, but the council doesn't take any objections in relation to climate change or any of those other issues that she raised. In the end, the disagreement on design may well go nowhere. Ms. Bevan tells us that for all her criticisms of the scheme, it would give rise to no more than limited harm to openness. In terms of national policy, that's the point which is determinative now, because she accepts that there would not be substantial harm to openness. It follows from her evidence that our scheme's appropriate development in the green belt, the test at 148 of the framework's not engaged, and that the appeal should instead be determined by applying the tilted balance. Obviously, I'll come back to that in a minute. We'll turn away from openness then to greenbelt purposes. The greenbelt serves 5 purposes. The parties agree that we would not cause any harm to 3 of them. The parties appear to be very close to agreeing on a 4th purpose, purpose B, which is to prevent towns merging into one another. Ms. Cook accepted that as it stands, there's a substantial buffer between the towns of Billericay and Basildon. She accepted that even with the appeal scheme in place, the substantial buffer would remain. She accepted that our site's not big enough to create a real risk of these towns merging. She accepted that the council's own evidence base for its now shelved local plan concluded that residential development on the site wouldn't harm the function or role of the wider Greenbelt area. Nonetheless, disagreeing with that assessment, she maintained there'd be conflict with purpose B, giving rise to limited harm. And with respect, that's not a tenable position. Because if there's no risk of the 2 towns merging, then it's difficult to see how there can be a conflict with purpose B, which is of course all about towns merging. As Mr. Crawford explained, even with the appeal site in place, there'd be a clear separation between the towns of Billericay and Basildon. And as he explained, there'd be no perception of a loss of separation between the two towns. The appeal site's only a very small and well-contained part of the wider Greenbelt parcel on the edge of Billericay. There'd therefore be, as both Mr. Crawford and Mr. Bell concluded, no conflict with Greenbelt purpose B, no harm be weighed in the planning balance in this regard. Now, the appellant acknowledges that the proposals would cause some harm to purpose C, and that's the purpose about assisting and safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. That's an inevitability that the appeal site is deemed to be countryside purely because it's part of, but next to, but outside the settlement boundary, notwithstanding that the boundary is a relic of another plan-making era. The site does not have the character of rural and undisturbed countryside. It has the character of an edge of settlement site, one with, as Ms. Bevan accepted, suburban influences. In the wider landscape, Mr. Crawford considered that the appeal scheme would not change that current perception. Views of the development would be restricted. There'd still be views across the larger agricultural fields. And so Mr. Crawford concluded that conflict with purpose C would give rise to only minor harm. His conclusion is consistent with the council's evidence base for the now shelved local plan, give you a reference to it. And it's obviously one with which Mr. Bell agreed. And notes, albeit the council contends in its closings that the October 2018 Greenbelt topic paper omitted consideration of purpose C, that's wrong. The summary on page 58 of that document refers to limited harm to Greenbelt purposes. That's all of them. We can tell that the authors of the study had all of the purposes in mind just by scanning through their assessments for other sites where there was thought to be harm arising in respect of purpose C. You're going to have to flip forward a couple of pages, or one page, sorry, to page 59. And there's a site at Greenlees Farm, Billericay, and there the conclusion is there'd be harm in respect of terms of encroachment, obviously not for us. The council's closings assert that the simple fact of an otherwise open field being developed for housing must mean that there is a significant impact on that purpose. Well, that is, with respect, simplistic, and it's quite wrong. And just for one example, see the analysis of Inspector Masters in the Colney Heath case, which, as you know now, is another edge of settlement site which involved housing development on entirely greenfield agricultural fields. The inspector concluded, and I'm just skim through what she said. She said she'd already set out her assessment of character and appearance, that site had an urban edge of settlement character. Well, same here. She'd made a clear distinction between the appeal site in that case and its separation from countryside outside the site, same here. And in this way, she said the appeal site is influenced by the surrounding residential development. Well, we say same here. As a result of these locational characteristics and influences, the consequences of the development on the appeal site would mean that proposals would only have localised effect on the Greenbelt, same here. The broad thrust of function and purpose of the Greenbelt in this location would remain, and there'd be no significant encroachment into the countryside, same here. She therefore concluded, this is my underlining, not hers, that the appeal proposal would not result in harm in terms of the encroachment of the Greenbelt in this location. The neutral factor, she decided, which weighs neither in favour of nor against the appeal proposals. And the same kind of analysis applies here, albeit, of course, Mr. Crawford does accept some, albeit only minor harm in relation to this purpose. Mr. Crawford said he could not decipher precisely how Miss Cook reached her conclusion, but he thought that by affording significant harm to conflict with purpose C, she was overstating what would be a very limited effect. Overall then, sir, on the Greenbelt, trying to tie all those threads together, Mr. Crawford found harm in terms of openness, there'd be negligible harm to the assessment parcel beyond the appeal site, there'd be no conflict with purpose B, and so no harm there. And whilst there would be conflict with purpose C, there'd only be minimal change to the wider Greenbelt in that regard. And as a result, he concluded that overall, the appeal proposals would have a negligible impact on the ability of the wider Greenbelt to continue to perform its spatial role and function. So, sir, striking the balance, in the end, the position is straightforward. Section 38(6) requires you to begin by determining whether the proposals accord with the development plan. Not whether they accord with each and every policy in the plan, but of course whether they accord with the plan read as a whole. Now, there is, as Mr. Bell observed, something of a vacuum in local policy in this case. Only 4 development plan policies are agreed to be relevant. One's a policy about crime prevention, with which it's agreed that we can comply through condition. Another concerns affordable housing, and we exceed obviously what's required there. The Council's Greenbelt policy GB1 doesn't, as Mr. Bell explained, provide any guidance for decision makers as to how individual planning applications should be assessed. It just defines the Greenbelt boundaries. The Council alleges conflict with only one part of one development plan policy, criterion 1 of BE12, and of course relying on Mr. Pell and Mr. Crawford's evidence, Mr. Bell explained there is no conflict with that or any other policy. In any event, he considered that even if you disagree and find a conflict with policy BE12, Roman 1, the proposals would accord with the development plan read as a whole. We turn then to other material considerations in section 38.6, which, as Mr. Bell observed, end up being the focus in a case like this, where the development plan is so dramatically, so staggeringly out of date. The most important of these material considerations is the issue of whether the appeal proposals would constitute appropriate development in the Greenbelt. On that issue, only one component has not yet been agreed, the question of whether the proposed development would cause substantial harm to the Greenbelt's openness. And that really is the question now on which the whole case turns. If you were to find that there'd be anything less than substantial harm to openness, sir, then the Council's accepted through its planning witness that you should allow the appeal. And so the Council ends this inquiry by asking you to choose between the evidence of its 2 witnesses. As we've said, that's because one of the witnesses agreed with us there'd be not be substantial harm to openness, if you like. And if you were to accept this, then on the Council's own evidence, the Council's case is the appeal should be allowed. And that's a result which is prescribed by national policy. 149G of the framework tells us development will not be inappropriate in the Greenbelt if it would not cause substantial harm to the openness of the Greenbelt, and it would reuse previously developed land, and it would contribute to meeting an identified need for affordable housing. It's agreed that limbs 2 and 3 of that exception are satisfied. It's agreed that if you were to find that the proposed development would give rise to anything less than substantial harm to openness, be it significant, moderate, limited, then the proposed development will be appropriate development in the Greenbelt. Ms. Cook accepted that the determinative test in national policy would then be, and just when I say then, in a world where you find it is not inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. This is important for this point about Monkhill. So in a world where you find not inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, then the balance is the tilted balance at 11D2. That's to say permission should be granted unless the scheme's benefits are significantly and demonstrably outweighed by its harm. Ms. Cook accepted that the Council's case would not meet the high bar set by that test. In her view, the appeal proposals would cause substantial harm on the one hand, but there'd be at least 2 substantial benefits, which means that on her analysis, the scales would be evenly balanced. And so the test at 11D2 isn't satisfied and the appeal should be allowed. Now, despite all of that having been agreed by all the planning witnesses, it was put to Mr. Bell in cross-examination that the tilted balance is not engaged because it's a Greenbelt case. And that is with respect a submission that's made with that foundation, either in the evidence before the inquiry or in planning policy or indeed in case law. Mr. Atkinson bases the argument on this Monkhill case that you've got before you. Now, in that case, at paragraph 18 of the Court of Appeal decision, the Court of Appeal recorded what Mr. Justice Holgate had said about all of this in the High Court. And he'd said, among other things, in his 15-point plan, point 12 was that the application of some footnote 6 policies, and just pausing there, that he's talking about an earlier iteration of the framework, so that's now footnote 7 policies. The application of some footnote 6 policies, e.g. Greenbelt, he said, requires all relevant planning considerations to be weighed in the balance. That's the really important thing to underline. Requires all relevant planning considerations to be weighed in the balance. In those cases, because the outcome of that assessment determines whether planning should be granted or refused, there's no justification for going back to limb 2. He means that the tilted balance in addition to limb 1. In other cases, the relevant footnote 6, now footnote 7 policy may not require all relevant considerations to be taken into account. So that's what it turns on. Does the relevant footnote 7 policy require all relevant considerations to be taken into account? Now here, all the case law, actually the analysis is pretty straightforward. Just take it in stages. If the development is inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, which it's not, if it is, then the test at 148 of the framework applies. Now that is a test which requires all material considerations to be taken into account. So we're in paragraph 12 territory of the judgment there. If you decide that it's a 148 case, VSC's inappropriate development. Okay. In such cases, if the 148 test is failed, which is to say that the scheme's benefits are clearly outweighed by its harms, then there will be a clear reason for refusing planning permission within the meaning of 11D1. And when that test applies, it's determinative. And so win or lose, if you like, on the VSC test at 148, you don't then need to go on to consider the tilted balance. Just pausing there, if you think about it, that's obviously right, because there's no way that you could, win one test and lose the other. Mm-hmm. The VSC test is determinative if it applies, right? So we agree, as I say at the bottom, with all of that. But it is not relevant here, because here our primary case is that this is not inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. Not that it's inappropriate, that it's not inappropriate. And on that analysis, the test at 148 of the framework does not apply. The Greenbelt chapter of the framework does not, in consequence, set out what the test is to decide an appeal, which in the language of Monkhill, quote, requires all relevant considerations to be taken into account, because the one which would have done, which is 148, is not engaged anymore. There's no clear reason for refusing planning permission anymore within the meaning of 11D1, because national policy does not presume against new development in the Greenbelt unless that development's inappropriate. Something, as you remember, Mrs. Cook agreed. The tilted balance at 11D2 has not, by the application of the 148 test, which is the VSC test, been displaced, because that 148 test on our analysis is not engaged. And so Ms. Cook was right to agree that if there is less than substantial harm to openness of the Greenbelt, it is to the tilted balance at 11D2, which is the determinative test. And as the council accepts that its evidence can't meet the high bar set by that test, then of course, as she said, the appeal would have to be allowed. That's the Monkhill point, sir. I just ask, have you got any questions on what I've written there before I keep reading?
No, thank you.
If you were to reject the evidence given on openness on behalf of the appellants, and indeed on behalf of the council by Ms. Bevan, then it's agreed that the determinative test would then become 148 of the framework. That's to say, planning permission should be granted if the scheme's benefits clearly outweigh its harms. Now, on this, which is only our secondary case, Mr. Atkinson is right to say that Monkhill establishes that the tilted balance would not apply. It's the VSC test, it's the 148 test alone that's determinative. We say it's passed. As Mr. Bell explained, the scheme's benefits clearly outweigh its harms. Now, on one side of the scale, so you have before you extensive evidence of our benefits. Most importantly, we deliver desperately needed market and affordable homes in a sustainable location on previously developed land, which proposed for allocation to the council's most recent attempt at adopting a new local plan. The council accepts that that a very substantial weight should be given to at least part of the scheme's affordable housing offer, and that substantial weight to be given to the provision of market homes, given the scale of the crisis in Basildon, and consistent with other appeal decisions. Mr. Bell instead gives each of these benefits very substantial weight, and he identifies other substantial benefits: use of brownfield land within the settlement boundary and the provision of a 10% BNG. Now, on the other side of the scales, there's no credible evidence of harm of anything like that order. The harms are almost entirely limited to the appeal site itself. Whilst there will be, of course, a moderate loss of openness within the appeal site, a negligible degree of harm to the wider Greenbelt, the moderate minor adverse effect of the landscape character will be limited to the appeal site itself. We don't accept that any harm at all would arise from the scheme's design. But anyway, as Mr. Bell explained, even if all the matters identified in Ms. Bevan's evidence were accepted across the board, we'd only be in the territory of minor harm. Yes, part of our site is an equestrian field with no buildings on it, which means in the language of Greenbelt policy, that part of the site would be less open if new homes were built. And yes, of course, because part of the site is next to, but outside the settlement boundary, it's deemed countryside. And even though the boundaries are a relic of another plan-making era, which means, as we've said, that in the language of the framework, our scheme would encroach into that countryside, albeit in a very limited way. But with respect, that's the kind of narrow approach to development management which has prevented this council from getting out of the mess that they're now in. And we know that until only months ago, the council was promoting our site for release from the Greenbelt to meet its spiralling needs for housing. The plan may have been shelved. The needs it was seeking to address remain, and the reasons for releasing this site for residential development are just as profound today as they were then. And for those reasons, we ask you to allow the appeal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you to everybody. Before we close, are there any applications for costs?
No.
Okay. In that case, just like to thank everybody for their hard work and for arranging this case and enjoyable inquiry. So,
sorry, I hate to hold us up, but I understood you were going to look at the civil compliance.
Oh, yes.
Statement as part of the section 106.
In the end, I decided that any questions I had have been answered by how we discussed the 106. But obviously, if anyone does want to raise anything on that more generally, they can do so now.
No, so nothing from us. There was just one that there was going to be a question from us. Might be in the runs of a cheeky question from us. Might sense where it's going. Do you have any sense? I don't know what the official time, like what the official do you have any sense as to
I think, given my own diary, either just before or just after half term. I think week before, maybe last full week. Well, half term where I live is the week commencing the 20th of October, I think. So you definitely won't be coming out during half term.
That's good news.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. The inquiry is closed. Thank you.